This film tackles a big question. Can nature replace agriculture as a way of producing meat? In a time of climate change and a raging biodiversity crisis, most of the proposals we hear in the public debate continue to rely on improving upon our current mode of production. In this animation, we will take another approach. We will explore an idea that is based on nature's mode of production. The idea is very simple, and it is called wild food systems. First of all, let's define the scenario. What is a wild food system? A wild food system is a completely different way of producing meat. It is produced through rewilding the landscape and sustainable hunting, instead of producing it through farming. It means swapping from raising pigs, cattle, and chicken inside feedlots into hunting wild boar, deer, and duck in forests optimized for this purpose, with the aid of all the science and technology of our time. That is the idea of the wild food system. It would not be the kind of nature we see in our local forest today, but would recreate the actual native ecosystem, which, seen with modern eyes, has an astonishing diversity and density of wildlife. Instead of a timber forest with a few deer, think of it as a savanna-like landscape roamed by thousands of large grazers. Let's describe it with an example. Imagine a township somewhere in Central Europe. Let's call it Hemmingstrup Township. In all aspects, it fits the global average. It is an imagined place, but it is representative of the statistical distribution of land use in the world right now. If we go to a random place in the world, chances are its land use will be divided roughly like this. Almost half of the area is used for farming. 80% of this farmed land is used solely for livestock production, either directly or as animal fodder. And roughly 20% are plant produce grown for human consumption. Now let us imagine Hemmingstrup Township decides to transition from livestock farming into a wild food system. What would that look like? In the huge areas where they grow fodder for their livestock living in feedlots, they instead build an ecosystem teeming with wildlife for sustainable hunting. You can think of it as sustainable fishing, only on land, an ecosystem that is a wild habitat and at the same time a sustainable food source. This is how they do it. First, they retire a selected part of the monocultural fodder crop fields and regreen the area. Then they rewild the native wildlife back into it and allow the land to rebuild its health, hydrology, soil layer, resilience, and so on. Then after a decade or so, when the wildlife populations has established high numbers, they start to harvest the game in the optimal way. Swapping their meat source this way makes a tectonic improvement on biodiversity in their area because it allows them to return a big percentage of their farmed land back into nature. So by eating more wild, they could make their landscapes more wild. They still continued to grow fruit and vegetables in managed fields, as plant produce cannot be harvested in the wild on a large scale. Meat, however, can. Insanely, because Hemmingstrup Township is rewilded, managed, and harvested the right way, it actually provides an amount of meat per hectare from wild game comparable to what livestock production did before. Now, would what we have just envisioned happening in Hemmingstrup in any way be possible in real life? There are actually surprisingly compelling reasons to think it could work. The arguments are rather subtle, and we are going to explore them as we take you through all the components of this idea in the following 5 chapters. The first chapter outlines the potential benefits it could have and why we might want to have a wild food system. The second chapter is on the productivity of the system and how it works. The third chapter is an unbelievable case story. And the fourth chapter explores how we might make this thing, step by step. And finally, we have a frequently asked questions. Chapter 1. So, why would we want a wild food system? Let's consider the potential benefits. Livestock production takes up more space today than anything else. So the potential of swapping this for a form of production that is essentially wild nature could provide some huge secondary benefits. Here comes a list of 9 positive impacts it could have. While feeding us, it would. 1. Act as a nature reserve, providing safe havens for myriads of life forms, including small mammals, insects, amphibians, and birds, all of which have no shelter or food to find in a crop field. 2. It would regenerate precious topsoil. 3. Carbon capture. Building topsoil binds CO2, and quite a lot of it. By some estimates, regenerating soil on farmed land could sequester most of the atmospheric carbon released since the Industrial Revolution. 4. Capture and purify drinking water, and also provide protection from floods and droughts. If big enough, it would even start to generate rainfall. 5. It would establish a high standard of animal welfare. The animals would live like they evolved to do, and with thousands of times the space they have now. 6. Provide healthy meat. Game meat is a superfood. It is one of the most valuable forms of nutrition there is. We have a whole chapter on this in the end. 7. Be a resilient food system, able to persist in the face of climate change. Biodiverse systems can survive extreme weather events that kill a crop field. These will be increasingly common in the future. 8. It would require very little input after being established. 9. It would make a new type of landscape that could be accessible and could maybe even be a beautiful place we wanted to hang out or go camping. Intensive livestock farming does none of these things. It actually does the opposite. Here comes the 9 corresponding negative impacts it has. It acts as a wildlife desert. To wild animals, crop fields are uninhabitable. Destruction of natural habitat this way is the main reason wildlife populations on average have seen a 69% decline in the last 50 years. It erodes topsoil. Intensive agriculture eventually leads to soil exhaustion. It provides a big output, but it erodes the soil it relies on. It releases a third of the greenhouse gases globally. It causes enormous animal suffering. It produces unhealthy meat. It is increasingly becoming evident that the sole focus on yield in industrialized meat production creates empty calories that are linked to the worldwide rise in chronic diseases. It is not that meat is unhealthy, but how it is produced makes the difference. 6. It is fragile in the face of climate change, susceptible to collapse from droughts, flash floods, or crop pests. It drains and pollutes drinking water and devastates marine environments. This means that intensive agriculture often comes with the price of sacrificing the productivity of fisheries. And then there is irrigation. In many areas, agricultural biomass relies on pumping huge volumes of groundwater much faster than it is recharged, and in this way it doesn't reflect a carrying capacity that can be sustained. 8. It is heavily reliant on pesticides, fertilizers, and antibiotics. It is completely sealed off, inaccessible areas. These problems are not complicated, they are just big. The reason all this matters is the scale of livestock farming. It happens almost everywhere. Whenever we look at a map or out of a window of a car or an airplane, we see them. The endless, enormous monocultural fields. What displaces wild nature globally is actually not really the cities and built environment. It is farming. Farming covers more than half of the planet's habitable surface today, which makes it Earth's primary landscape. The overwhelming majority of this area is used solely for livestock production, either directly or for growing the animal fodder. This slow but steady change of the landscape has essentially replaced the wildlife of the Earth with livestock. Apart from humans, 93% of the biomass of vertebrates on Earth today are livestock. So the room for improvement here, literally, is unparalleled. No other land cover takes up as much space. Turning the system into a form of production that is essentially wild nature could help restore an area of a size impossible to achieve when nature is in conflict with food security and compete for the same areas. The question is it possible? Let's compare the 2 different ways to produce meat. Currently, we produce domesticated livestock, which are kept inside feedlots and fed predominantly by a monoculture crop. On the other hand, wild food systems would produce native wildlife, which is free roaming and migrating, all while being fed by wild vegetation. So which one feeds more animals? Or rather, which one is better at harnessing the energy of the sun? Because that's what supports the whole animal biomass. Over here is well-developed perennial plants growing in thick living soil. The soil is always covered and moist, even when the last rain was months ago, whereas over here, the soil is a thin crust and is left bare for much of the year. The crops here live for a single season and have shallow roots. Part of the growing season is wasted because the crops have to germinate and grow big before they can utilize the sunlight. Whereas these plants start the growing season with well-developed roots and start growing the minute the sun shines. Are we saying a crop field is a terrible idea? No, not at all. It's a brilliant idea. In fact, one of the best and most important ones ever. You can drive a combine into it and harvest a truckload of carrots or wheat. It's great, and you obviously can't do that in nature because the plants are mixed. So in order to harvest a crop efficiently, we need to domesticate the ecosystem. But this is not necessary with meat, which can be obtained with an array of advantages directly from undomesticated nature. The wild animals are perfectly able to collect their own fodder. By harvesting game meat, we harness the productivity of the undomesticated ecosystem. Plants are perfectly able to grow at max efficiency and optimize themselves. Nature evolved to do this and does it very well. All it needs is sufficient space, an area allowed to go wild, with herbivores able to migrate, in a landscape free to change. This simply does not exist anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere today because of the livestock farming. Wait a minute. Who are we to challenge agriculture, this millennia-old practice that covers half the world? Are we conspiracy theorists? Where do we have these claims from? And what's with this weird emoji film? We are not scientists, but in fact studied art and film and architecture respectively. This film started in a real-world encounter when we visited Ethiopia. Here in a nature reserve, we saw something weird. Inside there was a lush green landscape full of antelope and warthog, but right outside the fence the vibrant life stopped. On the outside, which was farmed, were an endless dusty brown landscape with very few cows, and this surrounded the entire reserve. We couldn't help but wonder whether people in fact would be fed better by turning the entire area into a nature reserve and tapping this productive wildlife resource systematically, not just here but in Europe as well. So intrigued were we that when we came back to Denmark, we started trying to read the academic literature about this and reached out to dozens of scientists, but were shocked to realize that nobody had any answer for this question. And in fact, it had never been tried. Not only that, but nobody even knew what the natural abundance of wildlife in Europe or North America was. So Niels enlisted in geography at the university and dove into the data to compile an opinion paper. In particular, one paper published by Nature had a mind-blowing finding. It found that swapping wildlife for livestock across Africa had lowered the total animal biomass. So the deeper we looked, the more we realized that the potential of a wild food system really needed to be investigated and tried out. Not just intuitively, but according to the data. We are not here to tell you that it is possible or not. We present the reasoning and the sources, and you can make up your own mind. You can find our opinion paper and all the academic sources the film is based on in the link in the description. Now back to the film. Chapter 2. Could a wild food system really produce a substantial amount of meat? In order to actually be a viable alternative to livestock production, a wild food system would have to supply a comparable amount of meat. Could it really do that? In the 1800s, there were between 30 and 60 million bison in North America, along with an unbelievable 3 to 5 billion passenger pigeons and 5 billion prairie dogs. As we all know, these populations were tragically displaced and eradicated, but these numbers should help us keep in mind that nature has produced insanely high populations of wild animals just a few hundred years ago. This is a testimony to two things. Ecosystems have a very high productive potential, but they can be broken if they are pressured the wrong way. You can think of them as strong yet delicate. This characteristic comes from their interconnectedness. The more wisely they are used, the more productive they can become. We will use the following 3 chapters to explain this in the necessary detail, and use this to propose a way to hunt optimally. Is the historic abundance of wildlife gone for good, or can it be rebuilt? Let's avoid too many guesstimates and look at real-world examples. Today, a one-of-a-kind nature reserve in the Netherlands has succeeded in restoring a remarkably high abundance of wildlife. They have allowed big herbivores to go wild for 30 years, and the population here has reached a density comparable to extensive livestock production. Oostvaardersplassen is unique in its radical rewilding, but it is also a rare, if not the only example of something else too: nature in a really fertile area. Wild nature today generally exists in the inherently infertile places such as mountains, semi-deserts, snow-covered areas, or on soils deficient in key nutrients. All the most productive places such as fertile lowlands are taken up by farming. This maybe make agriculture appear more productive than it really is when compared to nature. Perhaps it's not so much that agriculture fosters life, as it is that it covers the areas that are inherently most favorable for life. Let's look at another real-world example. In countries in southern Africa, game ranching, which is quite similar to a wild food system, is increasingly replacing livestock farming because they have found it to have all kinds of advantages. They find the meat return of game superior, and they also find it to be much more resilient in several ways. Importantly, this is what they have arrived at in the only continent of the world that has intact ecology today, and where many of the farms are also large enough to act as independent ecosystems. So what about the land masses in the Northern Hemisphere? Could the same be the case here? When we imagine wild nature as it is today in Europe or North America, it could obviously not produce an amount of meat comparable to farming. Most often, it looks something like this: lots of trees and very few big wild animals. However, is this really the landscape nature arrives at in these areas when given free reins? Today, ecologists believe that no. If we were to wind back the clock to before farming or to the last interglacial in Europe or North America, the landscape we would set foot in on most of this landmass would not be a closed canopy forest, but a very different landscape. It actually used to be much more open, and this landscape would be teeming with wildlife, with vast migrating herds of large grazing mammals such as caribou, bison, aurochs, and elk, but also elephants, rhinoceros, camels, hippos, lions, and hyena lived here. Each continent had its own endemic megafauna. We often think many of these are specifically tropical species, but elephants are as native to Europe or North America as crows and foxes. We could call this landscape a sort of cold savanna, a mosaic mix of grasslands, scrubs, and ancient trees, the northern version of the Serengeti. This was a world created by animals. You can think of the animals as nature's gardeners. They sowed, fertilized, pollinated, and groomed the vegetation in a way which made it grow better than without animals. How exactly did this work? For one thing, the animals cause destruction. The way big animals trample, topple trees, graze, and defecate actually stimulates complexity and ultimately growth of the plants and soil. Ruminants prefer to eat the tender shoots of bushes and trees, so when they browse, they seek out and destroy woody growth, and this prevents the trees from taking over completely. So they effectively select for a varied and fast-growing plant cover of perennial grasses and herbs. Wild herds naturally graze an area briefly, but in high intensity, and then leave the plants to rest. This keeps the grass locked around its maximum growth rate and in its most nutritious state. When the grass is short, it grows slowly, and when fully mature, it stops growing and starts producing stalks and seeds and loses its nutritional value. But natural grazing keeps the grass right there in the sweet spot in the middle. In drier areas, grazing also has the effect of preventing too much grass to grow long and wither into dried stalks, and hereby become fuel for wildfire. The very biggest of the animals, the megafauna, were crucial for driving these dynamics. But all animals played some role in this system that made sure every plant was sowed, fertilized, pollinated, and groomed. As the animals moved and migrated, they transported seeds in their dung and fur. Different species of plants hitchhiked on different animals. Most plants rely on some form of animal help to stay properly distributed. Nutrients traveled the same way, in the guts and dung of animals. When millions of, for example, geese or bison migrate across thousands of kilometers, it is enough to make a real difference. This way, the building blocks of life found their way uphill, upstream, and upwind, where otherwise the landscape would be very barren. Other animals created habitats vital to whole branches of the ecosystem. Such animals are called ecosystem engineers. Beavers and wild boar, for example, create the spaces many other species rely on. The absence of plows and agrochemicals allowed the soil biota to develop a complex interplay between roots and mycelium. This created a spongy layer of carbon-rich, black topsoil and kept nutrients and water in steady supply. It also hosted myriads of insect species, which were the little things that made everything work. They were crucial to the recycling and pollination of all the different plants. In combination, this sped up all processes in the ecology, from decomposition to reproduction. You could say that biodiversity made the ecological engine run faster. All this together gave the plant community everything it needed to grow better, and in turn, it fed more wildlife. This formed a positive feedback loop of abundance, where the ecosystem locked itself in increasing diversity and productivity. These so-called emergent properties only arise if the ecosystem is sufficiently large and complex. The take-home message is that the effects of the browsing animals are often overlooked. They create the openings and stimulate complexity, and this complexity reinforces the plant growth and, in turn, the animals. Full circle. This self-reinforcing loop is broken when the big animals are removed, which they have been progressively for the last 10,000 years. It becomes a nature that is more silent, empty, monocultural, and static than it should be. This defaunation has happened even in the places we consider most wild, such as nature, reserves, and national parks. The loss of biodiversity can be hard to notice because it is just an absence. This is the forest many of us have learned to equate with nature. This nature lacks both the destruction, pollination, grazing, and seed and nutrient dispersal the animals provided. Until recently, this warped nature was considered pristine and formed the basis of ecological textbooks and the aims of conservation. It formed the baseline of what we consider a natural landscape is supposed to look like and how many animals there should be in it. When imagining nature as an alternative to farming, we have to compare it not to your average modern forest, but to the actual native ecosystems here. A kind of nature that is foreign to us right now because it's been gone from our land masses for a very long time. The good news is that experiments show that the ecological dynamics can be recovered surprisingly fast when the missing species are reintroduced. Soon, all of the dynamics re-erupts. However, for this to function, it requires a high diversity of wildlife that gets a huge area and is allowed to go wild. To sum up, all these processes matter greatly for the long-term carrying capacity. The basic argument we make is that the offtake of these two systems would be somewhat equal. As we mentioned, the wild food system would not be a recreation of a modern baseline nature reserve, but a landscape with the fauna and ecological mechanisms that nature evolved to rely on, which maximizes biomass. Why? Think about it this way. The wild system and livestock farming are both fueled by the same amount of sunlight. The wild food system does use up some of its photosynthetic energy on making plants for a lot of species that are not harvested. And also the animals here expend a lot more energy on running and other things. So this is energy that doesn't end up in the offtake. But we argue that this actually works as a long-term investment in expanding the bottlenecks of life in the system and making it more resilient and productive as a whole. And in this way, it more than makes up for it, because over time, the sum of life here is greater. Chapter 3. Restoring the Natural Abundance. People used to think that the natural amount of fish in the Gulf of Mexico looked something like this. Ever since the 1950s, the advent of modern marine science, the marine environment had looked this way. But in an experiment in 1995, the ecosystem was given a chance to recover. What happened then surpassed all expectations. The fish population first doubled, then quadrupled, and eventually grew to 5.5 times the size it had been before. More of the fish reached adulthood and big sizes, which meant there were more breeding fish that spawned more. With the benthic communities growing back, the fish hatchlings had shelter and were more successful. This sped up the rate at which the population grew. After a mere decade, the sea was back in pristine conditions. It was like taking a time machine back to prehistory. Soon fisheries in the surrounding areas started catching more and bigger fish than they had done in a very long time, and this improved offtake was sustainable. They could catch the fish with less effort, smaller boats, and less invasive nets. This is a well-known situation. A once overfished stock is kept down by quite little fishing and keeps giving a very small harvest. In response, the fishing industry deploys more effective fishing equipment, which briefly pays off but only exacerbates the root problem. The fish stock is now even smaller and grows even less. But by giving it a complete break from fishing, the fish stocks have a chance to rebound and now give a much bigger offtake every year, sustainably. The fishermen don't need giant trawling nets anymore. The harvest takes a lot less effort and equipment. This can be a blueprint for the management and use of wildlife resources anywhere and at any time. Ecosystems can diminish or grow, and by restoring them to their most productive state, we get simultaneously more food and more wild nature. This effect has been called fish less, catch more. Before this restoration, nobody knew that this was actually the natural abundance of marine life in the Gulf of Mexico. It had been in decline for so many generations that it had been collectively forgotten. This phenomenon is known as ecological amnesia, or shifting baseline syndrome. The perception of what is normal changes without people noticing it. After the restoration, the people in the area achieved everything at once. All stakeholders came out as winners. They restored biodiversity, rebuilt the food security, and the fisheries economy at the same time. A wild food system would be the land version of this story. It would work by first rebuilding the natural abundance and then harvest it sustainably. Chapter 4: How to make a wild food system. Let's say we tried to create a wild food system. We go back to Hemmingstrup Township, our imagined example. As we explained in the beginning, the landscape of Hemmingstrup fits the average distribution of land covers in the world today. Half of it is farming, with 80% of it being fodder crops and 20% of it being food crops. The wild food system is for producing sustainable meat, not fruit and vegetables. So this will continue to be grown in managed fields, perhaps with a bit of reorganization. The remaining 80% of the farmed land, which is used to grow crops destined to feed livestock. This massive portion of the landscape is converted into the wild food system. Artificial draining is largely phased out, and a natural hydrology gradually reappears. Rivers start braiding and meandering again. Meanwhile, the practice of plowing and spraying agrochemicals is put on hold. The whole area is ring-fenced. It has to be because otherwise the amount of wildlife will disrupt infrastructure and crops. Then, species of wildlife indigenous to the area are gradually reintroduced. These include bison, wild boar, beaver, elk, horses, camels. Certain extinct species are replaced with extant substitutes. Wild ox, for example, is rewilded as the proxy for the aurochs, and a few Asian elephants are rewilded as a proxy for the extinct European elephants. Then some time is allowed for the populations to rebound and recover, and for the natural dynamics to begin to emerge. We record and observe. The wildlife starts breeding, roaming and foraging, and the landscape starts changing. Streams and open water begin to appear in new places. The wildlife gradually gets to know the landscape. The animals settle into a rhythm with the seasons and adjust their behavior to take advantage of seasonal bounty, which will naturally vary throughout the space and the year. This way, they arrive at migratory habits. The opposing forces of big grazers opening up the vegetation and trees closing it again balance each other into an ever-changing landscape. Some places become more forested, other areas develop a savanna, or wood pasture-like character. At any time, any species from insects, amphibians, birds, or small mammals are able to find that specific space it needs somewhere to complete its life cycle. As the need arises, wildlife bridges and tunnels are deployed along with road fences. Then, when the wildlife populations are really large, people start hunting in an organized, sustainable way. They find the optimal level, and this level is maintained. They use the maximum sustainable yield approach that is used in sustainable fisheries. The area is divided between undisturbed no-take zones and hunting zones where spillover game is hunted. The area is run as a mix of public and private land. Farmers wanting to transition their land are offered economic incentives to gap the transition period. This is considered an investment in biodiversity, water quality, and carbon budget. Hunting is organized both by professional companies and by citizens buying tags for specific animals. This generates revenue for the landowner, so the landowner is incentivized to keep the stocks healthy. The stocking rate of the land grows, the more species it gets. Members of one species will only live in a certain density, but other species have other niches and overlapping territories. So when an area is full of roe deer, it still has space left for other species, because they exploit something else in the landscape. It is a non-zero-sum game, as most things are in wild nature. Care is taken to spread out the hunting across many different species because the lesson from history has been learned. Historically, hunting has led to the collapse of populations, not by taking too much in a general sense, but by taking too much of the same species at the same time and at the same place. This undermines a local population's ability to bounce back. Once brought low, a progressively smaller harvest can bring a population to zero where it stops growing at all. In other cases, hunting has centered on the wrong species such as megafauna, which reproduce very slowly but are crucial to the ecology. Now, hunting does the opposite and focuses on keeping populations healthy and locked around their max growth rate, and makes sure not to cross the tipping points. What really changes in the daily lives for people living next to the wild food system? In the adjacent urban area, life goes on, same as before. There is more wild food served in restaurants, though, and wild meat is available in supermarkets. People start seeing far more birds migrating over the sky, and they also start getting their windshields splashed with insects again. In the rural area where the transition happens, people experience the scenery greening and the air filling with much more birdsong. The hills are covered by wildflowers in the spring and rise to a busting climax of colors and life in late summer. The locals discover the sensation of animal herds and sights such as skies full of butterflies. Extirpated species such as storks and nightingales start to reappear. Another thing, the people of Hemmingstrup feel a sense of relief because they know that the biosphere, at least locally, is recovering year after year. What else changes? The formerly cropped areas that used to be off-limits to some degree become areas people can use again and become alive in a new way. People can go for a walk, picnic, or hunt in places that, roughly speaking, no person has set foot in for 50 years. The vast majority of people living in the area were not employed in the livestock business, so there is no mass unemployment. The rural area has struggled with creating enough jobs and now sees an opportunity to develop in a whole new way, involving new jobs such as guides, managers, scientists, hunters, and game wardens of the wildlife reserves. Will it work or will it fail? That can simply only be settled by trying it out. Ideally, it would be an area comprising a total of 50,000 hectares or more and be given sufficient time to establish itself. probably 20 years. However, as we have outlined, it could be worth it many times over. We have outlined the main reasons why it could be suspected to actually work from a biological perspective, and of course it would require sufficient public support, which is a whole other ballgame. For more reading on this and a more detailed discussion, you can find an opinion paper in the link in the description. Here, you will also find an estimate of the productivity of a wild food system in Europe and references to the academic publications that this film is based on. Frequently asked questions. Number 1. Why did we start farming livestock if nature is actually better at producing animals? One answer could be this. It emerged from the way we share or can't share common resources. The forces driving livestock farming could have been mainly social and practical ones, rather than biological. Much like we today make fish farms instead of rebuilding the wild fish stocks. Not because it makes more or better fish, but because making a small closed system can be done without relying on cooperative behavior from strangers. Livestock farming evolved gradually in several places in the world as a backup meat source to hunting. Domesticated animals were valuable for their milk, eggs, wool, fertilizer, and as a means of transportation and a workforce. Eventually, someone discovered it was practical to focus more on raising livestock, because it was smarter to have some cows, goats, and pigs than to run around chasing fit and dangerous wild animals. It was not because nature produced too little meat, but because being a livestock owner was more accessible, reliable, convenient, and safe whenever hunting luck was bad. There was not much of a trade-off initially. The animal owners could still hunt whenever they wanted. Livestock owning got popular and spread into the wilderness, and so the wild grazers were gradually displaced by domesticated grazers. The livestock was property while the wild game was an open resource. This incentivized to kill game whenever you could, but to protect and take good care of your livestock. Killing wildlife gave a free meal while getting rid of a competitor to the grazing resource. Killing your livestock on site, however, was obviously a bad idea. This differential treatment slowly but surely domesticated the biomass and landscape. On the whole, this practice did not give the land a higher carrying capacity, but that didn't matter, since it still presented the individual farmer with advantages. And that would have been enough to make it spread, in a spontaneous, unplanned manner, over millennia. Gradually, the wild habitats shrunk and became islands in a sea of agriculture. The wild populations got smaller and more isolated and became susceptible to overhunting. The feasibility of hunting dropped, and the incentive to get livestock grew. The disadvantages of agriculture become apparent at some point, but are shared, whereas its benefits belong to its owner. This is a prisoner's dilemma situation that often prevails in the use of open access resources. Successfully optimizing a shared resource and preventing the tragedy of the commons requires some form of institutions which can coordinate and enforce good practice. Today we live in a world where large-scale organization has become possible. We have science and all kinds of infrastructure. All this makes it possible for the first time to manage and harvest wildlife meat in the optimal way. Frequently asked question number 2. What about health? Would swapping industrial meat for wild meat have an impact on our health? Yes, quite a lot, it seems. Wild meat contains fewer of the unhealthy and more of the healthy kinds of fats, and it is way more nutrient-dense than farmed meat. Now, why is it like that? What is it that makes wild food healthier than industrially farmed food? The answer lies in the soil it all comes from. The soil that nourishes the crops, and in turn the animals, is fundamentally different in wild nature from the soil in industrial agriculture. When soil develops naturally without plows or chemicals, a wildly complex interplay between mycorrhizal fungi, plants, and other soil organisms emerges. This system mines the minerals underneath it and assembles an astonishing array and density of vital compounds that make their way into the plants that grow in it. When these plants get eaten by foraging animals, the nutrients accumulate in the animals. The nutrients flow from the soil to the plants growing in it, and into the food web, and eventually to the people who eat the wild plants, or the wild meat sourced from it. Now, the soil under agriculture is not able to do this, because it is dead. There are almost no soil organisms. Mycorrhizal fungi get severed by plows, and invertebrates get killed by pesticides. It's not really soil, but a dead substrate. The only nutrients available for the crops are the ones we put in the fertilizer we pour on it. This diet of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium is enough to make plants grow, but they end up with only a small fraction of the nutrients of a wild plant. At a microscale, it is made up of something entirely different than wild plants. When livestock get raised on these plants, the meat ends up containing way too few nutrients and the wrong kinds of fats. The result is that the animals are so unhealthy they can only survive when they get fed antibiotics constantly, just as the crops need pesticides to stay alive. This health difference ripples onto us when we base our diet on it. In other words, you are what your food ate. This difference should also be included as a factor when comparing the productivity of a wild food system with a livestock system. Are we measuring calories or nutritional value? Are we measuring current production or the projected future production long term? Are we including or excluding water content in the meat? A kilo of industrially farmed meat contains more water than a kilo of wild meat. Food security is more than quantity of production. Just as importantly is the nutritional value and the long-term stability and cleanliness of that production. Frequently asked question number 3. Isn't veganism a far more sustainable option? Eating more plant-based is a no-brainer. It is good for the planet and for us. And we strongly urge people to do this. But as we mentioned, nature relies on its big grazers to drive the dynamics that create biodiversity of a self-restorative landscape. So it is important here to note that wild populations have an inherent growth rate. For an example, if there is plenty of forage, it takes a deer population a few years to double. This exponential growth means that 2 deer in 20 years can turn into 4,000 deer. In another 10 years, 130,000 deer. Left alone, they will pretty soon overgraze and devastate the vegetation and soil and then be wiped out by starvation. They have to be regulated somehow. Before Homo sapiens came to Europe and North America, lions, saber-toothed cats, and hyena were among the natural predators that did this job. If we want wild nature, our options are either to rewild a lot of big carnivores into the system, such as packs of lions, and it would have to be thousands, or to have human hunters as a civilized predator. This first option somehow seems very unlikely to happen in the near future in densely populated places. In any case, swapping livestock farming for wild food systems would be a huge leap forward for anyone concerned with animal welfare. Thanks for watching.